sun, man," Swan said, sounding harassed. She looked it as well, with her hair sticking up from the constant raking of her fingers. "We have plenty of time." Moiraine did look at the sun, sitting low in the west, and she was not so sure. It was 6 miles back to the tower, the last of it through streets that would be just as crowded come nightfall as they had been that morning. Excuses would not be admitted. Frowning, Steeler opened his mouth, but abruptly the leathery-faced woman who had given them wine was right in front of him with 6 or 7 others, all gray-haired or graying, crowding him and forcing him back. "You leave those girls be," the lean woman shouted at him. "You hear me?" More women came running from every direction, until Steeler was surrounded 10 deep and his guardsmen as well. Half the women seemed to be screaming and shaking fists, while the rest scowled in sullen silence and gripped the hilts of their belt knives. The anvils went still once more, the blacksmiths watching the crowd of women closely and hefting their hammers. Young men, boys really, began to gather, all hot-eyed and angry. Some had their belt knives drawn. Light, they were going to have a riot. "Right," Swan commanded. "They won't hold him long. Your name?" she demanded of the woman in front of her. Moiraine wrote. The women waiting to give their names seemed to agree with Swan. There were no more arguments. By this time they knew the questions and spilled out the answers as soon as they came in front of her, some so quickly that she had to ask them to start over. When Steeler and his men finally managed to push through the women encircling them without doing anything that would have brought the men and boys still in the camp running, Moiraine was blowing on the last name to dry the ink, and Swan was hastily straightening her hair with her carved blackwood comb. The bannerman's face was grim behind the steel bars of his face guard, but all he said was, "We'll need a bit of luck now." He led them out of the camp at a trot, with the horses' hooves flinging clods of snow and Swan bouncing in her saddle so badly that he assigned men to ride on either side of her and keep her from falling. Clinging desperately to the tall pommel of her saddle, she grimaced at them, but she did not order them away. Moiraine realized that Swan had never asked for the ointment. She was going to have more need of it than ever. After half a mile, Steeler slowed to a walk, but only for another half-mile, and then he picked up the trot again. Only the 2 soldiers kept Swan in the saddle. Moiraine started to protest, but a glance at Swan's determined face and another at the sun held her quiet. Swan would take days to forgive her calling attention to how badly she rode. She might never forgive her if she caused them to be called to Marian's study for being late. That was the pace Steeler kept all the way back to the city. Trot, then walk, trot, then walk. And Moiraine suspected he would have maintained it there, if not for the crowded streets. A walk was the best they could manage in that throng. The sun was just a low dome of red gold atop the walls of the tower grounds when they rode into the yard of the west stable. Grooms came out to take Arrow and Swan's mount, along with a sour-faced young under-lieutenant who scowled up at Steeler, even as he returned the bannerman's salute, an arm laid across the chest. "You're the last," he growled, sounding as if he wanted an excuse to lash out at anyone who was handy. "Did they cause problems?" Helping a groaning Swan dismount, Moiraine held her breath. "No more than lambs," Steeler replied, and she exhaled. Stepping down from his horse, the bannerman turned to his men. "I want the horses rubbed down and the tack oiled before anybody even thinks of supper. You know why I'm looking at you, Malvin." Moiraine inquired of the young officer what they should do with the lap desks. He glared at her before saying, "Leave them where they are. They'll be collected." And he stalked off so quickly that his cloak flared behind him. Why is he so angry? She wondered aloud. Steeler glanced at the guardsmen leading their animals into the stable, then answered in a voice too low for them to hear. "He wanted to go fight the Aiel." "I don't care whether the fool man wanted to be a hero," Swan said sharply. She was leaning on Moiraine, who suspected that only her arm around the other woman's waist was keeping her upright. I want a hot wash in my bed, never mind supper." "That sounds lovely," Moiraine breathed. Except the part about supper, anyway. She thought she could eat a whole sheep. Swan managed to walk on her own, but she hobbled, tight-jawed and clearly suppressing groans. She refused to let Moiraine carry her script, though. Swan never gave in to pain. She never gave in to anything. When they reached their gallery in the Accepted's quarters, thoughts of hot water vanished. Katerina was waiting. "About time," she said, huddling in her banded cloak. "I thought I'd freeze to death before you got back." A sharp-faced woman with a mass of wavy black hair that hung to her waist, she could have an acid tongue. With novices and other Accepted, she could. With Aes Sedai, she was milder than milk water, all obsequious smiles. "Marian wants you in her study, Moiraine." "Why does she want us?" Swan demanded. "It isn't full sunset even now." "Oh, Marian always tells me her reasons, Swan. And it's just Moiraine this time, not you. Well, you've been told, and I want my supper in my bed. We have to do this whole miserable thing over again tomorrow, starting at sunrise. Who'd have thought I'd rather stay in and study than go for a ride in the countryside?" Swan frowned at Katerina's back as the other woman flounced away. "One day she'll cut herself with that tongue. Do you want me to come with you, Moiraine?" Moiraine wanted nothing more. She had not done anything, not lately, yet a summons to Marian's study was never good. Many of the novices and Accepted visited that room to cry on Marian's shoulder when homesickness or the strain of learning grew too great. A summons was another matter entirely, but she shook her head and handed her cloak and script to Swan. "The jar of ointment is in there. It is very good for soreness." Her friend's face lit up. "I could still come with you. I don't need salving that badly." "You can barely walk. Go on. Whatever Marian wants, I am sure she will not keep me long." Light. She hoped Marian had not uncovered some prank she thought safely hidden. But if so, at least Swan would escape punishment. In her present state, she could not have borne that. The study of the Mistress of Novices lay on the other side of the tower, near the novices' quarters and one level below the Amerlin's study, on a wide hallway where the floor tiles were red and green and the runner blue. Moiraine took a deep breath in front of the plain door between two bright wall hangings and patted her hair, wishing she had taken time to use her brush, then knocked twice, firmly. Marian told everyone not to tap like mice in the wainscoting. "Come," a voice inside called. Taking another deep breath, Moiraine went in. Unlike the Amerlin's study, Marian's was rather small and quite plain, the walls paneled in dark wood, the furniture sturdy and completely unadorned for the most part. Moiraine suspected that women who had been Accepted 100 years ago would recognize everything in that room, maybe 200 years ago. The narrow tea table beside the door, lightly carved on the legs in a strange pattern, might well have been older than that. And one wall held a mirror, its frame spotted with faded fragments of gilding. Against the opposite wall stood a narrow cabinet that she avoided looking at. The strap and the switch were kept in there, along with a slipper that was worse in a way. To her surprise, Marian was on her feet rather than seated behind her writing table. She was tall. Moiraine's head only reached Marian's plump chin, with hair that was more gray than not, gathered at the nape of her neck, and a motherly look to her that almost overwhelmed the agelessness of her features. That was one reason most of the young women in training felt comfortable weeping on Marian's shoulder, despite her having made them weep herself often enough. She was also kind and gentle and understanding, so long as you did not break the rules. Marian had a positive talent for finding out what you most wanted to keep hidden. "Sit down, child," she said gravely. Moiraine warily seated herself on the stool in front of the writing table. It had to be bad news of some sort. But what? "There is no way to make this easy, child. King Layman was killed yesterday along with both of his brothers. Remember that we are all threads in the pattern and the wheel weaves as the wheel wills." "The light illumine their souls," Moiraine said solemnly, and may they shelter in the Creator's hand until they are born again. Marianne's eyebrows twitched upward, doubtless in surprise that she had not burst into tears on hearing that she had lost 3 uncles in one day. But then, Marianne did not know Layman Domodred, a distant man who burned with ambition, the only warmth in him. Moiraine's opinion was that he had remained unmarried for the simple reason that even the inducement of becoming Queen of Cairhien was not enough to convince any woman to marry him. Moressin and Aldacane had been worse, each filled with sufficient heat for 10 men, which they had expressed in anger and cruelty, and in contempt for her father because he was a scholar, because he had taken another scholar for his second wife, rather than marrying to bring lands or connections to House Domodred. She would pray for their souls, yet she felt more sadness for Jack Wynne than for all 3 of her uncles combined. "Shock," Marianne murmured. "You're in shock, but it will pass. When it does, come to me, child. Until then, there's no need for you to go out tomorrow. I'll inform the Amerlin." The Mistress of Novices had the final say when it came to novices and accepted. Marianne must have been put out to learn that Tamra had sent them out of the city without consulting her. "Thank you for the kindness," Moiraine said quickly. "But please, no. Having something to do will help, and being with friends. If I remain behind tomorrow, I will be alone." Marianne seemed doubtful, but after more soothing words to soothe the hurt she seemed sure Moiraine must be hiding, she let Moiraine return to her room, where she found both of her oil lamps lit and a fire crackling on her hearth. Swan's work, no doubt. She thought of dropping into Swan's room, but the other woman was certainly fast asleep by now. Supper would be available in the dining halls for at least another hour, but she put away any thought of food and instead spent that time kneeling in prayer for her uncle's souls. A penance. She did not mean to be one of those sisters who took on penances at every turn. Maintaining a balance in their lives, they called it. She thought it ostentatious foolishness. Yet she should feel something for the deaths of her own blood kin, however horrible they had been. It was wrong not to. Only when she knew that the dining halls would be full of serving women mopping the floors did she rise and undress to wash herself, after using a trickle of fire to heat the water. Cold water would have been another penance, but there were limits. Extinguishing her lamps, she wove a ward to keep her dreams from affecting anyone else's. That could happen with those who could channel. Others nearby could find themselves sharing your dreams, and crawled beneath her blankets. She truly was tired, and sleep came quickly. Unfortunately, nightmares came too. Not of her uncles or even of Jack Wynne, but of an infant lying in the snow on Dragonmount. Lightning flashed in the pitch-black sky, and his wails were the thunder. Dreams of a faceless young man. There was lightning in those dreams too, but he called this lightning from the sky, and cities burned. Nations burned. The dragon was reborn. She woke, weeping. The fire had burned down to a few glowing coals. Rather than adding more wood, she used the fire shovel to scoop ashes over the coals, and rather than climbing back into bed, she wrapped a blanket around herself and went out into the night. She was not sure she could go back to sleep, but one thing she was certain of: she did not want to sleep alone. She was certain that Swan must be asleep, but when she slipped into her friend's room, quickly closing the door behind her, Swan said softly, "Moiraine?" A few flames still flickered on Swan's small hearth, giving enough light to see her pull one side of her blankets back. Moiraine wasted no time climbing in. "Did you have nightmares too?" "Yes," Swan breathed. "What can they do, Moiraine? Even if they find him, what can they do?" "They can bring him to the tower," Moiraine replied, putting more confidence into her voice than she felt. "He can be protected here." She hoped he could. More than the Reds might want him dead or gentled, whatever the prophecies said, and educated. The Dragon Reborn would have to be educated. He would need to know as much of politics as any queen, as much of war as any general, as much of history as any scholar. Varen Sedai said that most mistakes made by rulers came from not knowing history. They acted in ignorance of the mistakes others had made before them. He can be guided. that would be the most important of all, to make sure that he made the right decisions. The tower can't teach him to channel, Moiraine. That was true. What men did was different. As different as men and women, Varen said. A bird could not teach a fish to fly. He would have to survive learning on his own. The prophecies did not say that he would, or that he would avoid going mad before the last battle, only that he had to be at Tarmon Gaiden for any hope of victory. Yet she had to believe. She had to. Do you think Tamrai's having bad dreams tonight, Swan? Swan snorted. Aes Sedai don't have bad dreams. They were not yet Aes Sedai, however. Neither of them could close their eyes through the rest of the night. Moiraine did not know what Swan saw, lying there staring up at the ceiling. She could not make herself ask. But she saw a babe crying in the snow on Dragon Mount, and a faceless man calling down lightning. Being awake was no protection against these nightmares. Chapter 6. Surprises. A scratching at Swan's door near morning proved to be a timid novice named Setsuko, a stocky girl shorter than Moiraine, who told them that the Amerlin had ordered all accepted to be at the West Stable before third rise, ready to carry on with their task. By the light of the lamp she carried, Setsuko's pale eyes were bleak with envy. The Arafellan girl already knew that her stay in the tower would end in a few months. Setsuko had talked openly of running away, until a visit to Marian's study taught her discretion, if not wisdom. Bitter as the knowledge must be, she could never reach the shawl, but she must be kept until the sisters were certain she could channel without harming herself or others. Despite that, she still might have flight in mind. Novices did run from time to time, and even the rare accepted who flinched at what lay ahead of her, but they were always caught eventually, and their return to the tower was painfully unpleasant, to say the least. It was much better for everyone if that could be avoided. Another time, weary as she was, Moiraine might have offered comforting words, or a caution. This morning, however, the gong for first rise had already sounded, and it was no more than half an hour to second. They could snatch a bite to eat and reach the stable before third, but only just. Yawning, Moiraine gave Swan a last hug and hurried out into the darkness, wrapped in her blanket, before Setsuko reached the next door and began scratching, trying to wake Shiriam. The child would have to do better. Shiriam slept like the dead. Half a dozen novices carrying lamps were tapping at other doors, ghostly images in the night. At hers, a very tall girl with golden hair spilling down her back offered a sulky curtsy when Moiraine dismissed her. Lysandra would be allowed to test for accepted, but only if her sulkiness could be cured. Likely it would be. When the tower saw a fault in one of its students, that fault usually was cured, one way or another. She washed and dressed hastily, barely taking time to scrub her teeth with salt and soda and brush her hair into some semblance of order. Yet when she reached the gallery with her scrip hanging beneath the edge of her cloak, the darkness was definitely gray. Swan was already outside, cloaked and ready, talking to a visibly chafing, flame-haired Shiriam, and other accepted were already scurrying to breakfast. "Shiriam says the Aiel really are retreating, Moiraine," Swan said excitedly, hitching her scrip on her shoulder. "She says they're all leagues east of the river." Shiriam nodded and started to follow the others, but Moiraine caught the edge of her cloak. "Are you certain?" Moiraine nearly winced. Had she been less tired, she would have used greater care choosing her words. You learned nothing if you put someone's back up to start. Luckily, the slim accepted had none of the temper that her hair and her tilted green eyes might have indicated. She merely sighed and looked longingly toward the door leading from the gallery. "I had it first from a guardsman who had it from a Shienaran soldier, a courier, but later I was told the same by Serafella, by Rima, and by Janet. One sister may be mistaken, but when three tell you something, you may be sure they have the right of it." She was an enjoyable companion to pass an evening with, yet she did have a way of making casual statements sound like lectures. "Why are you two grinning like fools?" she demanded suddenly. "I didn't know I was grinning," Swan replied, schooling her features. She still looked eager, rising up on her toes as though to run. "Is not a chance to ride in the countryside worth grinning over?" Moiraine asked. Now, perhaps, they could convince their escort to take them to the camps closest to Dragonmount. She was unsure exactly when she had adopted Swan's view, yet it was her own now. They would find him first. Somehow they would. Grin? She could have laughed aloud and danced. "Sometimes you two are passing strange," Shiriam said. "I'm saddle-sore near to hobbling myself. Well, you can stand here and talk if you wish. I want my breakfast." But as she turned to go, she stopped dead and exhaled in shock. Marian had come onto the gallery in the fading darkness, her vine-woven shawl draped over her arms so the blue fringe almost brushed the floor. She attracted a good many stares from the accepted. Sisters seldom wore their shawls inside the tower except for official occasions. An appearance here by the Mistress of Novices wearing hers meant someone was in very deep trouble, or else being summoned for testing. A few of the women lingered on the gallery hopefully, while a handful sped off as fast as they could short of running, no doubt propelled by guilty consciences. They should have known better. All they achieved was to have Marian note them with a glance, and she would dig until she discovered what they felt guilt about. In Kyrian, a gooseherd would have known as much. She paid them no heed now, however, as she glided calmly along the gallery, the accepted she passed rising from their curtsies with regret painting their faces. Shiriam was one of those who lingered, and it was in front of her, Swan, and Moiraine that Marian stopped. Moiraine's heart fluttered, and she struggled to breathe evenly as she curtsied. She struggled just to breathe in the first place. Maybe Swan had been right. Well, she was right, in point of fact. When Marian said an accepted might test soon, it always came within the month. But she was not ready. Swan's face shone with eagerness, of course, her eyes bright. Shiriam's lips were parted in hopeful anticipation. Light. Every last accepted must think herself more ready than Moiraine Domodred did. "You'll be late if you don't hurry, child," the Blue Sister told Shiriam sharply. And surprisingly, Marian was never sharp, even when there was punishment in the offing. When she lectured on your misdeeds while applying switch or strap or the hated slipper, her voice was merely firm. As the fire-haired woman darted away, the Mistress of Novices focused her attention on Swan and Moiraine. Moiraine thought her heart would pound its way through her ribs. Not yet. Light, please, not yet. "I've spoken with the Amerlin, Moiraine, and she agrees with me that you must be in shock. The other accepted will have to make do without you today." Marian's mouth tightened for an instant before serenity returned to her face. Her voice remained a needle, though. "I'd have kept you all in, but people will cooperate better with initiates at the tower than with clerks, even White Tower clerks, and the sisters would be up in arms if they were asked to do the task. The mother was right about that much." Light. She must have argued with Tamra to be upset enough to say all of that to accepted. No wonder she was being sharp. Relief welled up in Moiraine that she was not to be whisked off and tested for the shawl immediately, yet it could not compete with disappointment. They could reach the camps around Dragonmount today. Well, one of the camps at least. They could. "Please, Marian, The sister raised one finger. That was her warning not to argue, and however kind and gentle she was in the general course of things, she never gave a second. Moiraine closed her mouth promptly. "You shouldn't be left to brood," Marian went on. Smooth face or no, the way she shifted her shawl to her shoulders spoke of irritation. "Some of the girls' writing is like chicken scratches." Yes, she was definitely upset. When she had any criticism, however slight, it was delivered to the target of it and no one else. The mother agreed that you can copy out the lists that are near unreadable. You have a clear hand. A bit overflowery, but clear. Moiraine tried desperately to think of something to say that the sister would not take for argument, but nothing came. How was she to escape? "That's a very good idea, Moiraine," Swan said, and Moiraine gaped at her friend in amazement. Her friend! But Swan went merrily ahead with the trail. "She didn't sleep a wink last night, Marian. No more than an hour at most, anyway. I don't think she's safe to go riding. She'll fall off inside a mile. Swan said that. I'm glad you concur with my decision, Swan, Marian said dryly. Moiraine would have blushed to have that tone directed at her, yet Swan was made of sterner material, meeting the sister's raised eyebrow with an open-eyed smile of innocence. She shouldn't be left alone, either, so you can help her. You have a good, clear hand yourself. The smile froze on Swan's face, but the sister affected not to notice. Come along, then. Come along. I've more to do today than usher the pair of you around. Gliding ahead of them like a plump swan on a stream, a fast-swimming swan, she led the way to a small windowless room a little down from the Amerlins' apartments and across the corridor. A richly carved writing table with 2 straight-backed armchairs behind it held a tray of pens, large glass ink jars, sand jars for blotting, stacks of good white paper, and a great disorderly stack of pages covered in writing. Hanging her cloak on a peg and setting her scrip on the floor by the table, Moiraine stared at that ragged pile as glumly as Swan did. At least there was a fireplace, and a fire going on the narrow hearth. The room was warm, compared to the corridors, much warmer than a ride in the snow. There was that. Once you've finished breakfast, Marian said, come back here and set to work. Leave the copies in the anteroom of the Amerlins' study. Light, Swan, Moiraine said with feeling as soon as the sister was gone. What made you think this was a good idea? You, Swan grimaced ruefully. We will get a look at more names this way. Maybe all the names if Tamra keeps us in the job. We could be the first to know who he is. I doubt there could be 2 boys born on Dragonmount. I just thought it would be you, not us. She breathed a gloomy sigh, then suddenly frowned at Moiraine. Why would you be brooding? Why are you supposed to be in shock? Last night, revealing her woes had seemed out of place, a trifle compared to what they knew the world faced, but Moiraine had no hesitation in telling her now. Before she finished, Swan enveloped her in a strong, comforting hug. They had wept on each other's shoulders much more often than either had availed herself of Marianne's. She had never been as close to anyone as she was to Swan, or loved anyone as much. You know I have 6 uncles who are fine men, Swan said softly, and one who died proving how fine a man he was. What you don't know is I have 2 others my father wouldn't let cross his doorstep, one his own brother. My father wouldn't even say their names. They're street robbers, shoulder thumpers, and drunkards. And when they've guzzled enough ale or brandy if they've stolen enough to afford it, they start fights with anyone who looks at them the wrong way. Usually it's both of them together setting on the same poor fellow with fists and boots and anything that comes to hand. One day they'll hang for killing somebody if they haven't already. When they do, I won't shed a tear. Some people just aren't worth a tear. Moiraine hugged her back. You always know the right thing to say. But I will still pray for my uncles. I'll pray for those 2 scoundrels when they die too. I just won't fret myself over them, alive or dead. Come, let's go to breakfast. It's going to be a long day, and we won't even have a nice ride for exercise. She had to be joking, yet there was not so much as a twinkle of mirth in her blue eyes. Then again, she truly did hate doing clerical work. No one enjoyed that. The dining hall most often used by Accepted lay on the lowest level of the tower, a large room with stark white walls and a white-tiled floor, full of long polished tables and plain benches that could hold 2 women, or 3 at a pinch. The other Accepted ate quickly, sometimes gulping their food with unseemly haste. Shiriam spilled porridge on her dress and hurried from the room, proclaiming that she had time to change. She very nearly ran. Everyone was hurrying. Even Katerina all but trotted off, still eating a crusty roll and brushing crumbs from her dress. It seemed a chance to leave the city was not so miserable at that. Swan dawdled over her porridge laced with stewed apples, and Moiraine kept her company with another cup of strong black tea containing just a drop of honey. After all, the chance that the boy-child's name was among those awaiting them had to be vanishingly small. Soon they were alone at the tables, and one of the cooks came out to frown at them, fists planted on her hips. A plump woman in a long, spotless white apron, Laris was short of her middle years and more than pretty, yet she could frown a hole through a stone. No accepted was ever fool enough to come over high-handed with Laris, at least not more than once. Even Swan gave way beneath that unwavering gaze, hastily spooning the last bits of apple from her bowl. Laris began calling for the scullions to bring their mops before Swan and Moiraine reached the door. Moiraine expected the work to be drudgery, and it was, though not so bad as she had feared. Not quite so bad. They began by digging their own lists out of the mound and added those already in a readable hand, which reduced the stack by half. But only by half. If you came to the tower unable to write, you were taught a decent hand as a novice, but those who came writing badly often took years to reach legibility, if they ever did. Some full sisters used the clerks for anything they wanted someone else to understand. Most of the lists appeared to be shorter than hers and Swan's, yet even counting Malin's explanation, it seemed that an astonishing number of women had given birth, and this was only from the camps nearest the river. Noticing Swan scanning each page before setting it to one side, she began doing the same. Without any great hope, yet vanishingly small was not the same as impossible, except that the more she read, the further her spirits fell. Many of the entries were shockingly vague. Born within sight of Tarvalin's walls? The city's walls were visible for leagues, visible from the slopes of Dragonmount. This particular child was a girl, with a Tyran father and a Kyrianan mother, yet the note boded ill for locating the boy-child. There were far too many like that. Or, born in sight of the White Tower. Light. The tower could be seen from nearly as far as Dragonmount. Well, from a good many miles at least. Other entries were sad. Celia Pomfrey had given birth to a boy and had left to return to her village in Andor after her husband died on the second day of fighting. There was a note beneath the name in Mirel's flowing script. Women in the camp tried to dissuade her, but she was said to be half mad or more from grief. Light help her. Sad to weeping. And in a colder vein, as troubling as the inexact entries. No name was recorded for her village, and Andor was the largest nation between the spine of the world and the Arith Ocean. How could she be found? Celia's child had been born on the wrong side of the Aranon and too early by 6 days, but if the Dragon Reborn's mother was like her, how could he be found? The pages were dotted with names like that, though usually they seemed to be women others had heard of, so the information might be written in full elsewhere. Or it might not. The task had seemed so simple when Tamra said it. The light help us, Moiraine thought. The light help the world. They wrote steadily, sometimes putting their heads together to decipher a hand that really did resemble chicken scratches. Took an hour at midday to go down to the dining hall for bread and lentil soup, then returned to their pens. Elida appeared, in a high-necked dress even redder than that she had worn the day before, to stride around the table and silently stare over first Swan's shoulder and then Moiraine's, as though to study their writing. Her red-fringed shawl was richly embroidered with flowered vines. Flowered, and more fittingly, barbed with long thorns. Finding nothing to criticize, she left as abruptly as she had come, and Moiraine echoed Swan's sigh of relief. Other than that, they were left alone. When Moiraine dusted her last page with fine sand and poured it into the wooden box sitting on the floor between the chairs, the hour for supper had come. A number of boy children had been born yesterday. The birth had to come after Gitara's foretelling, but not one had seemed remotely possible for the child they sought. After a night of troubled, restless sleep, she needed no urging from Swan to return to that small room, rather than joining the other accepted hurrying to the stables. Though some were not hurrying so quickly today, it seemed that even a trip outside the city could pall, when all you had to do was sit on a bench and write names all day. Moiraine was looking forward to writing names. No one had told them not to, after all, and they had been wakened by the sounds of the other women getting ready, not by a novice bringing orders to ride out with the rest. As Swan often said, it was easier to ask forgiveness than permission. though the tower was rather short on forgiveness for accepted. Yesterday's gleanings were waiting on the table, an untidy stack as tall as the first had been. While they were sorting out the readable lists, 2 clerks walked in and stopped in surprise. A stout woman with the flame of Tarvalin worked on one dark sleeve, her gray hair in a neat roll on the nape of her neck, and a strapping young fellow who looked more suited to armor than to his plain gray woolen coat. He had beautiful brown eyes and a lovely smile. "I dislike being set a task only to learn someone else is already performing it," the woman said acerbically. Noticing the younger clerk's smile, she shot him a cold stare. Her voice turned to ice. "You know better than that if you want to keep your place, Martin. Come with me." Smile sliding away in worry and red-faced with embarrassment, Martin followed her from the room. Moiraine looked apprehensively at Swan, but Swan never stopped sorting. "Keep working," she said. "If we look to be busy enough..." Her voice trailed off. It was a small hope if clerks had been assigned the work, but it was all they had. By a matter of minutes, they managed to be copying names by the time Tamra herself walked into the room. Wearing plain blue silk today, the Amelin was Aes Sedai calm made flesh. No one would have thought that her friend had died right in front of her only the day before yesterday, or that she was waiting on a name that would save the world. Tamra was followed closely by the gray-haired clerk, who wore satisfaction on her face like too much rouge, and young Martin stood behind her, smiling over his shoulder at Moiraine and Swan. He really would lose his place if he did that too often. Moiraine bobbed to her feet and offered her courtesies so fast that she forgot the pen in her hand. She felt it twist, though, and winced at the ink stain it left, a black smear spreading to the size of a coin on the white wool. Swan was just as quick, but much more steady. She remembered to lay her pen on the tray before spreading her skirts. Calm, Moiraine thought. I must be calm. Running through the mental exercises did little good. The Amerlins studied them closely, and when Tamra scrutinized someone, the most thick-skinned and insensitive felt measured to the inch and weighed to the ounce. Moiraine only just managed not to shift in unease. Surely that gaze would see everything they planned, if that could be graced with the name of plan. I had intended you to have a free day, to read or study as you chose, Tamra said slowly, still considering them. Or perhaps to practice for your testing, she added, with a smile that did nothing to lessen her scrutiny. A long pause, and then she nodded slightly to herself. You are still troubled by your uncle's deaths, child? I had nightmares again last night, Mother. True, but once more they had been of a baby crying in the snow, and a faceless young man breaking the world anew even while he saved it. The steadiness of her own voice amazed her. She had never thought she would dare give an Aes Sedai answer to the Amerlin seat. Tamra nodded again. Very well. If you think you need to be occupied, you may continue. When the boredom of copying all day overcomes you, leave a note with your finished work and I will see to replacing you. Half turning, she paused. Ink is very difficult to remove, especially from white cloth. I won't tell you not to channel to do it. You know that already. Another smile, and she gathered up the gray-haired clerk, herding her from the room. No need to look so indignant, Mistress Wellen, she said soothingly. Only fools upset clerks. Their mistakes, accidental or on purpose, could cause too much damage. I'm sure you have much more important tasks than... Her voice faded to a receding murmur in the corridor. Moiraine lifted her skirt to look at the stain. It had spread to the size of a large coin. Ordinarily, removing it would require hours of careful soaking in bleach that stung your hands and offered no guarantee of success. She just told me to use the power to clean my dress, she said wonderingly. Swan's eyebrows attempted to climb atop her head. Don't talk nonsense. I heard her as well as you, and she said nothing of the sort. You have to listen to what people mean as well as what they say, Swan. Interpreting what others really meant was integral to the game of houses, and put together, Tara's smile, the cast of her eye, and the phrasing she had used were as good as written permission. Embracing the power, she wove air, water, and earth exactly so, laying the weave atop the stain. Just because accepted were forbidden to channel to do chores did not mean they were not taught how. There was no such prohibition for sisters, who frequently traveled without a maid. The black smear suddenly glistened wetly and began to shrink, rising onto the surface of the wool as it did. Smaller and smaller it became, until it was only a small ebon bead of dried ink that fell into her cupped palm. "I might keep this as a memento," she said, setting the black bead on the edge of the table. A reminder that Swan had been correct. There were times when the rules could be broken. "And if a sister had walked in?" Swan asked wryly. "Would you have tried to tell her it was all part of the game of houses?" Moiraine's face grew hot, and she released the source. "I would have told her... Must we talk of this now? There must be as many names as yesterday, and I would like to finish before supper is done." Swan laughed uproariously. You might have thought the redness of Moiraine's face was a fool's paint. They had been writing above an hour when Moiraine came to an entry that gave her pause. Born in sight of Dragon Mountains, which was as ridiculous as saying inside of the tower. But Willa Mandair had given birth to a son west of the river, and on the day of Gitara's foretelling. She copied the entry slowly. Raising her pen at the end, she did not dip it in the ink jar or look for the next name in Elid's spiky hand. Her gaze rose to the ebon bead. She was one of the accepted, not a sister. But she would be tested soon. Billy Mandair could have been born on the riverbank and his mother still have been inside of Dragon Mount. But nothing Elid had written indicated how far the camp she had gone to was from the mountain, or how close. The earlier entries just said, "Born in Lord Elisar's encampment outside Tarvalon." The white page in front of her was only half filled with her writing, but she drew another blank sheet across the table and copied the particulars for Billy Mandair. A humble name if he was the one. But it was more likely the Dragon Reborn would be the son of a simple soldier than of a lord. Suddenly she noticed Swan writing in a little leather-bound book, small enough to fit in her belt pouch, while keeping one eye on the doorway. "You have to be prepared," Swan said. Nodding, Moiraine slid the page bearing a single entry across the table to Swan, who carefully copied the information into her little book. Tomorrow Moiraine would bring her own book. The day produced quite a few names of children born in sight of Dragon Mount, or even born near Dragon Mount, a number of them on the east side of the Aranin. Moiraine knew she should have expected it. The mountain was the most easily identifiable landmark for leagues, after all. But this was only the second day's list, and they added 9 more boys to Swan's book. Light, how many names would they gather before it was done? There were other surprises. Shortly after mid-morning, Jarna Malari swept into the room, elegant in dark gray silk, with slashes of white at her temples that added to her commanding presence, sapphires in her long black hair, and more around her neck. The silken fringe on her shawl was so long that it nearly touched the floor, with the shawl resting on her shoulders. Jarna was a sitter for the Grey. Sitters rarely seemed to notice accepted, but she motioned to Moiraine. "Walk with me a brief while, child." In the corridor, Jarna strolled slowly in silence for a time, and Moiraine was content to have it so. Light, what could a sitter want with her? A task to be done or a message to be carried would have been mentioned right away. In any case, accepted did not try to hurry sisters, as well attempt hurrying the Amerlin as a sitter. The drafts that made the stand lamps flicker did not bother Jarna, of course, but Moiraine began to wish she had her cloak. "I hear you are troubled by your uncle's deaths," the sitter said at last. "That is understandable." Moiraine made a sound that she hoped Jarna took for agreement. Aes Sedai answers were all very well, but she wanted to avoid outright lying. if she could. She tried not to strain for every inch, but the top of her head only came to the other woman's shoulder. What did the woman want? I fear that affairs of state never wait on grief, Moiraine. Tell me, child, who in House Damodred do you think will ascend to the Sun Throne now that Laman and his brothers are dead? Tripping over her own feet, Moiraine staggered and would have fallen had Jarna not steadied her with a hand. A sitter was asking her opinion on politics? Of her native land, to be sure, but sitters knew more of most countries' politics than their own rulers did. Jarna's liquid brown eyes gazed at her serenely, patiently, waiting. I have given the matter no thought, Aes Sedai, Moiraine said truthfully. I think perhaps the Sun Throne will pass to another house, but I cannot say which. Perhaps, Jarna murmured, half lidding her eyes for the space of the word. House Damodred has acquired an ill reputation that Laman only made worse. Moiraine frowned before she could stop herself, and hurriedly smoothed away the lines, hoping that Jarna had not noticed. It was true. Her father had been alone among his generation in lacking a dark character, men and women alike. The preceding generations had been nearly as bad, when not worse. The deeds done by House Damodred had blackened the name, but she did not like hearing anyone say it. Your half-brother Tarangale is denied by his marriage to the Queen of Andor, Jarna went on. A ridiculous law, but he cannot change it unless he is king, and he cannot become king until it is changed. What of your elder sisters? Are they not well thought of? The taint seems largely to have skipped your generation. Well thought of, but not for the throne, Moiraine replied. Anne Vair cares for nothing except horses and hawking, and no one would trust her temper, far worse than Moiraine's had ever been, on the Sun Throne. But that was something she would say only to Swan. And if Inloine gained the throne, everyone knows affairs of state would come a poor second at best to playing with her children. Likely because, in playing with her children, she had forgotten all about the affairs of state. Inloine was a warm and loving mother, but the truth was she was not terribly bright, although very stubborn. A dangerous combination in a ruler. No one will support either for the throne, Aes Sedai, even within House Damodred. Jarna peered down into Moiraine's eyes for a long moment, reminding her uncomfortably of Malin saying she could not read thoughts. There was nothing for it but to meet that gaze with patience and apparent openness, as well as a fervent hope that Malin had not found a way around the 3 oaths. I see, Jarna said finally. You may return to your work, child. What did she want? Swan asked when Moiraine returned to the room. I am not sure, she said slowly, taking up her pen. That was the first lie she had ever told Swan. She was all too afraid that she knew exactly what Jarna wanted. By the time they laid the completed copies on the rose-carved writing table that had been Gitara's in the spacious anteroom to the Amerlin's study, 6 more sitters had come to take Moiraine aside. 1 from each Aja, all with very much the same questions. Tsutama Wrath, beautiful and hard-eyed enough to make Moiraine flinch, put it to her directly. Have you never thought, Tsutama said casually, toying with the red fringe of her shawl, of being Queen of Cairhien yourself? Thus she gained another nightmare to join the babe in the snow and the faceless man. She sat on the Sun Throne wearing the shawl of an Aes Sedai, and in the streets outside the mobs were destroying the city. No Aes Sedai had been a queen in over 1,000 years, and even before that, the few who admitted it openly had fared badly. But if that was the goal of the Hall of the Tower, how could she forestall it? Only by fleeing the tower as soon as she did gain the shawl and staying away until matters resolved themselves in Cairhien. She spent most of that sleepless night praying to be tested soon. Even tomorrow would not be too soon. Light, she was not ready, but she had to escape. Somehow. Chapter 7. The Itch. The following day brought still more names that met the criteria and in larger number, all with vague reference to Dragonmount for the place of birth. Moiraine realized she and Swan would never see a name with "born on the slopes of Dragonmount" attached. The prophecies of the dragon were known to many people, though often known wrongly, especially among the common folk, but the mountain's connection remained in even the most nonsensical versions. No woman would want to admit that she had birthed a son who would channel the power one day with all that entailed, the child of her body doomed to madness and terror. How much less would she admit to bearing a child who might become the dragon reborn? She could not deny Dragonmount entirely, or her acquaintances might call her on it. Yet, near the mountain or in sight of it was safe enough. The child they sought would surely be hidden behind such a half-truth. Someone would need to visit each of those women with closer questions, prudently phrased and carefully asked. She rehearsed those questions in her mind, the delicate probing to elicit information while giving away nothing. Rouse the mother's suspicions and she would lie again, and likely run as soon as the questioner's back was turned. It would be playing Desdemar with the world at stake. Far from a task she would relish, yet how to resist imagining. The morning also brought a visit from Tamra, who abruptly walked in just as Moiraine was slipping her little book, bearing a fresh name, back into her belt pouch. She tried to disguise the movement, make it part of her curtsy, a touch of clumsiness brought on by surprise. She thought it well done, yet she held her breath as the Amerlin studied her. Had the other woman seen the book? Suddenly, the notion of asking forgiveness rather than permission seemed very frail. Discovery would gain them neither. In all likelihood, discovery would bring rustication, working on an isolated farm from sunrise to sunset, cut off from friends and studies, forbidden to channel. For novices and accepted, that was the penultimate penalty, one last chance to learn correct behavior before being sent away forever. Far worse than blistered hands, though, it would certainly separate them forever from the hunt for the child. "I'd have thought yesterday would have sated your appetites for boredom," Tamra said finally, and Moiraine breathed again. "Especially yours, Swan." Swan seldom blushed, but her face colored at that. Everyone knew her dislike of clerical work. Copying lines was the punishment she dreaded most. Moiraine put in, "The lists help me govern my thoughts, Mother." Once you began giving misleading answers, they came more and more easily, even to the Amerlin seat. In truth, those thoughts still flashed into her head when least expected, lists or no lists. Thoughts of a babe in the snow and a faceless man, equally dire, of the Sun Throne. She wanted to beg Tamra to halt that scheme, yet she knew begging would be useless. The tower was no less implacable in its weaving than the wheel of time itself. In both cases, the threads were human lives, and the pattern they made more important than any individual thread. "Very well, child, so long as your studies don't suffer." Tamra held out a folded paper that Moiraine had not noticed, sealed with a circle of green wax. "Take this to Karine Nagashi. She should be in her rooms. Give it to no one else." As if she would do that. Some accepted complained, very quietly and very privately, over having to climb the wide corridors that spiraled upward through the tower. But even with a climb halfway to the top, Moiraine enjoyed any errand that took her to the Aja quarters. A great deal could be learned through seeing people where they lived. Even Aes Sedai let their guard down in those circumstances. They did a little at any rate. Enough for one who knew how to listen and observe. The Aja quarters were identical in number of rooms and how they were laid out, but the details differed widely. The impression of a full-sized sword was worked into each of the huge white floor stones of the green Aja quarters. Swords in 24 different styles, single-edged and double, curved and straight. Every door along the hallways was carved with a sword, point up, gilded for the rooms of sitters, and silvered or lacquered for many others. The tapestries on the walls, between tall gilded stand lamps on bases worked in the form of stacked halberds, were of martial scenes, charging horsemen and battles and famous last stands, alternating with ancient battle standards from lands long dead, many torn and stained, and all preserved through the centuries by weaves of the one power. No Aes Sedai had ridden to war since the Trolloc Wars, but when the last battle came, the battle Ajah would ride in the forefront. Until then, they fought for justice where it often could be obtained only through their warders' swords, but that was just what they did while they waited on Tarman Gaiden. Another difference here was the number of men. Not just any men, of course. Warders. Tall or short, wide or slim, even quite stout in one case, they moved like lions or leopards. None wore the distinctive cloak indoors, but the cloak was a mere decoration for a discerning eye. You could see warders in any Ajah's quarters excepting the Red, but most kept rooms in the guards' barracks or even in the city. Green's warders often lived in the same apartments as the sister. A green-eyed warder who made up for his lack of height through width glanced at her as he strode by quickly as if on an errand. 3 others standing together fell silent at her approach, their quiet conversation taken up again after she passed. One wore silver bells in his dark Arafellan braids, one had a thick Tarraboner mustache, and the third was very dark, perhaps a Tyran or a southern Altaran, yet aside from the grace of their movements, there was another thing they shared with each other, and with the heavy-set man, and with every man to be seen here. Once, while hawking with cousins, she had looked into the eyes of a caped eagle with its ruff of black feathers around its head. Meeting a warder's gaze was akin to that. Not fierce, but full of self-knowledge, absolutely aware of their own capabilities, their capacity for violence. And yet it was a violence in restraint, disciplined by their own wills and their bonds to their Aes Sedai. Here they were simply going about their daily lives. A lean man, his head shaven except for a Shinaran topknot, was resting against a wall with one booted foot up, tuning a fiddle and ignoring the good-natured jibing of another warder, who said that it sounded like a wet cat caught in a net. 2 others in shirt sleeves were practicing with wooden swords in a broad side corridor, the bundled lathes clattering with each swift blow. Rena Halfden, who somehow made a square face lovely and a stocky build both elegant and graceful, was urging them on with a wide smile, calling, "Well struck, Waylon! Oh, very well struck, Elias!" For size, they might have been twins, though one was dark and clean-shaven, the other fair with a short beard. Grinning, they moved faster and faster. Their sweat-sodden shirts clung to broad shoulders and backs, yet the pair seemed fresh and untired. Through an open door, Moiraine saw a round-faced warder playing a stately melody on a flute, while gray-haired Jayla Bandevin, an imposing woman despite standing near a hand shorter than Moiraine, attempted to teach a new warder the steps of a court dance. He had to be new, a blushing, pale-haired boy of no more than 20, yet no man gained the bond unless he already possessed all the requisite skills. All save dancing, at least. Kareen's door, bearing a sword lacquered in red, gold, and black, also stood open, with the sounds of merry music coming out. Moiraine had no idea what the lacquering meant or the colors, and she suspected she never would unless she chose the green. That would not be, yet she disliked not knowing. Once she identified something she did not know, the ignorance became an itch on her shoulder blade, just beyond reach. Not for the first time, she filed the swords in the back of her mind, beside many other things seen in Ajah quarters. The itch receded, yet she knew it would return when next she saw these doors. The few tapestries in Kareen's sitting room were scenes of war or hunting, but most of the wall space was given over to bookshelves carved in the styles of half a dozen countries. Along with a few books, they held a large lion's skull and an even bigger from a bear, glazed bowls, vases in odd shapes, daggers adorned with gems and gold, and daggers with plain wooden hilts, one with just the nub of a broken blade. A blacksmith's hammer with the head split in 2 lay next to a cracked wooden bowl that held a single fat fire drop, fine enough to grace a crown. A gilded barrel clock with the hands frozen at just before noon, or midnight, stood beside a steel-backed gauntlet stained black, with what Moiraine was sure was blood. They and all the rest were mementos of well over 100 years wearing the shawl. Of memories before the shawl there were few. Just a row of painted miniatures on the wave-carved mantel over the fireplace, showing a plainly dressed, dignified man, a plump, smiling woman, and 5 children, 3 of them girls. They were Carine's family, long since passed into the grave, along with her nieces and nephews and their children, and their children's children, and more. That was the pain borne by Aes Sedai. Families died, and everything you knew vanished, except the tower. The White Tower always remained. 2 of Carine's warders were in the sitting room with her. Massive Careel, whose hair and beard gave him the aspect of a golden-maned lion, was reading a book in front of the fireplace with his boots resting on the ornate brass fender, a feather of blue smoke rising from the bowl of his long-stemmed pipe. Stepin, looking more a clerk than a warder with his narrow shoulders and sad brown eyes, sat on a stool playing a lively jig on a 12-string bittern, fingers flashing as skillfully as any hired musician's. Neither man stopped what he was doing for the arrival of an accepted. Carine herself stood working at an embroidery frame mounted on a stand. It always seemed incongruous to see a green doing needlework, especially when, as now, the subject was a field of wildflowers. How did that accord with the violence and death decorating her walls? A tall, slim woman, Carine looked exactly what she was, her ageless face strong and beautiful, her nearly black eyes pools of serenity. Even here she wore a riding dress, the divided skirts slashed with emerald green, and her dark hair, lightly touched with white, was cut shorter than either Careel's or Stepin's, above her shoulders, and gathered in a thick braid. No doubt it was easier to care for while traveling, cut like that. Carine seldom remained in the tower long before setting out again. She placed her needle on the embroidery frame, took the letter and broke the green sealing wax with a thumb. Tamra always sealed her messages to sisters with wax in the Aja color of the recipient. Of all Ajas and none. Whatever Tamra had written was quickly read, and no change came to Carine's face, but before the green finished,